Welcome once again to Encountering Jesus Now weblog. On this video I have compiled videos from others that give both historical and archaeological evidence that the Old Testament of the Bible is accurate and reliable. As you will discover, all of the historical and archaeological evidence focuses on one of three areas: the reality and accuracy of times, locations, and people and nations as they are compared with other historical records found from outside sources that we have. Then there is the issue of the precision and accuracy of the copies of the Old Testament text as they were passed down through the ages. And finally, there's the issue of the accuracy of the prophecies about future events that are stated in the Old Testament, and this is done by setting those prophecies alongside of the historical records that we have from other sources. Over the next few minutes, you will have the opportunity to watch two short videos that were produced by Kyle Butt. They will present a brief version of historical, archaeological, and prophetic evidence that is out there for anyone to investigate and see, which all point to the reality of the Old Testament text. Then there will be a more lengthy presentation given by Dr. Stephen Collins, an archaeologist for over 30 years and a teacher as well as a researcher and a trainer in New Eastern archaeology. His presentation will give a more detailed historical and archaeological glimpse at the evidence for the reliability of the biblical text for those who are interested in more detail. Finally, I want to offer a couple of other resources on this topic of biblical evidence for the reliability of the Old Testament. One is a book written by Kenneth A. Kitchen, a renowned archaeologist, and the book is entitled On the Reliability of the Old Testament. The second source is a video library from Ravi Zacharias and his international ministries, and they are available on YouTube. They offer philosophical and pragmatic evidence as to the reliability of Scripture. One example is called Why the Bible? Ravi Zacharias at the University of Illinois. He has a great variety of other videos available that address this topic. Let's now begin viewing these video presentations.
The Bible is the most historically accurate book ever penned. Hundreds of ancient discoveries verify its accuracy, and here's a list of 9 of those. Number 1, the Pilate inscription. In 1961, in an Italian-sponsored dig in Caesarea, archaeologists uncovered a stone that had a Latin inscription on it that said Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea. That Pilate is mentioned in the gospel accounts on several occasions. You read in John 19:29, Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" The find verifying the New Testament statement that Pilate was the prefect of Judea. Discovery number 2, Hezekiah's tunnel. In 2 Chronicles 32:30, we read a statement that says, "This same Hezekiah also stopped the water outlet of Upper Gihon and brought the water by tunnel to the west side of the city of David." You would think that if a king had dug a tunnel under Jerusalem, we would be able to find it, and that's exactly what we find. A huge tunnel that matches perfectly the biblical description of Hezekiah's tunnel. Discovery number 3, the Taylor Prism. In 1830, a man by the name of Robert Taylor uncovered a 15-inch tall clay cylinder. There are 500 lines of written text on this clay cylinder, And it was put there by a man named Sennacherib. Well, Sennacherib was a king of Assyria that you read about in the Bible. On the clay cylinder, here's what Sennacherib said. As to Hezekiah the Jew, he didn't submit to my yoke. I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities, walled forts, and to the countless small villages in their vicinity, and conquered them by means of well-stamped earth ramps and battering rams. It's interesting when you compare Sennacherib's statement of what he did with the biblical statement of what he did. In 2 Chronicles 32:1, we read, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and entered Judah. He encamped against the fortified cities, exactly like Sennacherib says he did. Discovery number 4, the David inscription. For many years, people said that David was a figment of the Israelite imagination because no archeological finds had been discovered that verified his existence. And yet, in 1993, in Tel Dan, there was a man who was working named Abraham Byron who discovered a stone, and on that stone was the inscription of an Israelite king from the house of David. The Bible uses that very designation in 1 Kings 12, verse 19. The David inscription validated the biblical text. Number 5, the Moabite stone. Found in 1868, it's a black basalt stone that measures about 3.5 feet high, 2 feet wide. On that stone, Mesha, the king of Moab, cut lines of text in about 850 BC. Mesha mentions that Omri was the king of Israel who had oppressed Moab, but then Mesha says he saw his desire upon Omri's son and upon his house. The Mesha stone cites Omri as the king of Israel, just as 1 Kings 16, 21 through 28 indicates. Furthermore, it mentions Omri's son, Ahab, in close connection with the Moabites, just as 2 Kings 3, 4 through 6 does. In addition, both the Steel and 2 Kings 3, 4 through 6 list Mesha as the king of Moab, and it further names the Israelite tribe of Gad and the Israelite God Yahweh. Another validation of the biblical accuracy. Number 6, the Nazareth house. In 2008, a skeptic named Rene Salm wrote a book that he claimed destroyed Christianity once and for all. He said that Jesus could not have existed because there was no town of Nazareth in the first century. In 2009, an archeological discovery was announced that they had found a small house in Nazareth that dated to the first century. The house was only about 900 feet square total, but it was large enough to provide evidence of the Bible's accuracy. Number 7, the Cyrus cylinder. In 1879, Hormuz Rassam found a small clay cylinder. It's about 9 inches long, and it's now in the British Museum of Natural History. In the ancient city of Babylon, he uncovered this, and this clay cylinder was commissioned by King Cyrus. And it had an inscription on it about his victory over the city of Babylon and his policy toward the nations he had captured. And the text said, I returned to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which have been in ruins for a long time, the images which used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. The policy, often hailed as Cyrus's Declaration of Human Rights, coincides perfectly with the biblical account of the ruler's actions, in which Cyrus decreed that the temple in Jerusalem would be rebuilt and that all the exiled Israelites who wished to join in the venture had his permission and blessings to do so. You'd read that in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. This little 9-inch long clay cylinder stands as impressive testimony that validates the biblical accuracy. Number 8, the discovery of the Pool of Siloam. In 2004, a majestic stepped entrance to the Pool of Siloam was uncovered in the area known as the City of David. In John chapter 9, verse 7, we read that Jesus said to a blind man, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Validation once again of the biblical accuracy. Number 9, the Hittite tablets. For many years, people made fun of the biblical text and said it mentioned people and places that never did exist. One of those groups was the nation of the Hittites. But in 1906, Hugo Winkler was doing some excavation in the Turkish city of Bagraz Koy. There he uncovered 10,000 clay tablets that documented the history of the Hittite nation, and they discovered that that area was the capital of the Hittite nation. In Joshua chapter 11, we read about the Canaanites in the east and the west, and the Amorite and the Hittite. In 1906, Hugo Winkler discovered the Hittite nation that the Bible had mentioned some 3,000 years before. It's called the Bible, and it contains scores of amazing prophecies that prove it to be from God. Let's quickly look at 5 of these prophecies. Number 1, the fall of Tyre. In the year 597 BC, the prophet Ezekiel made a bold proclamation against the city of Tyre. At the time, the city was one of the wealthiest and most secure cities in the entire world. It had massive walls. It also had an island city that the inhabitants, if they were attacked, could go out to that island city. Yet for all that, Ezekiel predicted several things that would happen to Tyre. He said that the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar would come up against the city, that he would build siege mounds against the wall, and the city's walls would be broken down. He predicted that many nations would come up against the city, and the city would be scraped clean like a rock. He predicted that its stones and its timber and its soil would be thrown into the sea. How are you going to get the stones and timber and soil of a huge city like Tyre thrown into the sea? As we look at history, secular history provides the answer for that. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, did come up against the city of Tyre. He did exactly what Ezekiel predicted, but it didn't stop there. Because after he built a siege mound against Tyre, the inhabitants moved out to the island city and he couldn't attack it. And yet, in about 330 BC, a man by the name of Alexander the Great attacked Tyre. And the inhabitants did the same. They went out to that island city, but Alexander the Great wasn't happy with a simple victory over the mainland city. He took the rocks and the timbers and the soil and scraped them clean, dumped them into the sea, and made a causeway out to the island city. How could Ezekiel have looked into the future more than 250 years and predicted what would have happened? Divine assistance. Number 2, the fall of Babylon. See, Babylon was one of the richest cities in the world during the years of about 740 to 680 BC. It had walls that were 75 feet thick. They were 300 feet high, and it was surrounded by the Euphrates River that made a moat around it, in some places 65 feet, in other places 250 feet across. And yet, the prophets in the Bible, Jeremiah and Isaiah, they prophesied that God would raise and cause to come up against Babylon an assembly of great nations. Jeremiah recorded that God had declared, "I will dry up her sea and make her springs dry." And the prophet foretold that a drought would come against her waters and they would be dried up, for the land is a land of carved images. And also the prophet promised that the Lord had spoken, "I will prepare a feast and I will make them drunk, that they may rejoice and sleep a perpetual sleep." Now, interestingly, secular history validates this prophecy. It shows us that the Euphrates River went under the city of Babylon, and yet Cyrus, the king of the Medes and the Persians, redirected the river and caused it to go into a basin, and he marched his troops under the wall of Babylon. And incidentally, the Babylonians were drunk and feasting when that happened. God dried up the waters of Babylon, and they were drunk and slept a perpetual sleep. Number 3, messianic prophecies. You know, there are hundreds of prophecies in the Old Testament that talk about a coming Messiah. They talk about how that Messiah is going to live, where he will be born, how he will die, how he will be buried, and the things that he would do in his life, like riding a donkey into the city of Jerusalem. And some of them were written 1,000 years before Christ came, and yet in every single instance, Jesus Christ fulfilled those prophecies to the letter. So much so that in Luke chapter 24, verse 27, Jesus taught his disciples, beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Number 4, the fall of Jerusalem. In Luke chapter 21, verse 20, Jesus said to his apostles, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near." In Matthew 24, 1 and 2, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." Jesus made these comments in about AD 30 or 33. And yet, for another 40 years or so, nothing happened of a remarkable nature of destruction to the city of Jerusalem. But in AD 70, the Roman army under the command of Titus, who later would become the emperor, destroyed Jerusalem in an event that is marked as one of the most destructive events in all of ancient history, exactly like Jesus Christ had predicted. Number 5, the reign of Cyrus. Isaiah wrote his prophecy in about 720 BC. In his book, he made a bold prediction that the great nation of Babylon would fall. He further specified that it would be destroyed by the Medes and the Persians, and then he narrowed the target and predicted that a king named Cyrus would be the man to conquer the city and the nation. Now, the interesting aspect of this prophecy was that it occurred almost 150 years before Cyrus ever even existed. Isaiah called him out by name. Can you imagine finding a document that was almost as old as the United States of America that mentioned you would be born and be doing exactly what you are doing today? That's amazing. When we look at the Bible and we see the amazing, historically accurate, documented, predictive prophecy.
Archaeology is the single best means of confirming the physical, historical reality of the Bible. Now, that should be the case, shouldn't it? If the biblical text rises from three-dimensional space-time reality, then we should be able to go to that same territory, that same real estate, and find evidence for the world it describes. Should we not? Yes, we should. And we do. And there's ample evidence. There's abundant evidence. It's growing and growing and growing. But people need to find out about it. So I thought I would do a thing tonight touching on, pretty much go through the entire Old Testament with various archaeological discoveries, some in the past, some very recent, who have given evidence of the historical credibility of the Bible. Is the Old Testament historically reliable? The Bronze Age Bible consists of Genesis through about the first half of the book of Judges. So Genesis into Judges. The Iron Age part of the Bible goes from midpoint in the book of Judges down to the end of the Bible, the Old Testament. So basically from Judges to Malachi. Iron Age. Everything before that, Bronze Age. These are two very distinct periods, very different culturally. The world internationally and locally is completely different in these two periods of time. And so you would expect that each of those segments of the Bible would be authentic to those particular archaeological time frames. So, I will introduce to you now some bits and pieces from what I call the Bronze Age Bible. First 5 books, plus Joshua, plus about half of the book of Judges. What I'm going to introduce to you here are things from the text that can be absolutely authenticated archaeologically, geographically, historically, that demonstrate the pristine accuracy of the biblical text to the time frames in which it is allegedly written. In this case, we're going to deal with the Bronze Age. Isn't it interesting that Genesis chapter 10 correctly identifies the Fertile Crescent, that is that geographical arc formed by Mesopotamia. I'm going to try to go your way. If I go this way, that's backwards to you. From Mesopotamia all the way over to the Levant, okay? The Bible identifies that as the cradle of civilization. And if we look at it, we can see that here's the ancient Near East, and there's that Fertile Crescent. The Bible identifies that as the place where civilization first emerges, where urbanization, where cities first come to bear in humanity. And so there it is. The Bible nails it. It's interesting that a book, if like the critics want to say, it's written by late Iron Age Judahite priests sometime around the 5th, 6th centuries BC, if it's written really late, if it's a piece of concocted fiction, then how in the world did they somehow broaden their scope of origins to include everything that modern anthropology and archaeology knows to be the case? How'd they guess that? Most native people, by the way, see the creation of the world, all the great events, everything leading up to their time, as happening in their locale. It's like the Native Americans, right? Everything happens right below our feet. We come out of the ground. But this is not what happens in the Bible. It shows the grand international entire spectrum of what we know to be true historically as to the rise of civilization. Moving right along. Abraham's covenants with Yahweh, Genesis 15 and 17, with Abimelech in Genesis 21, match the unique structure of Middle Bronze Age treaties and contracts, not those of earlier or later periods. It's interesting that the structure and details and outlines of covenants, contracts, and treaties change through time in the ancient world. The ones in the early Bronze Age are different from the Middle Bronze Age, which are very different from the Late Bronze Age, and totally different from the Iron Age. And guess what? When you analyze Yahweh's covenant with Abram and Abram's covenant with Abimelech, they match no other period of time other than the Middle Bronze Age, the authentic time for Abraham according to the Bible. I think that's fabulous. Here's another one. Sodom had to come up, didn't it? Well, the cities of the Kikar, Sodom itself, we now know, in spite of the fact that so many scholars through the centuries, or through the last 2 centuries, have said it didn't exist at all, we now know that it was located at Tal Hammam in Jordan. We know that it was the largest continuously occupied city in the southern Levant during the Bronze Age. It had a lot of cities and towns around it. It's over 100 acres in occupational footprint. It has massive defenses and ramparts and gates and palaces and administrative buildings. It has a 2,000-year history as a city-state, which matches up with Genesis chapter 10. And it met a horrible destruction toward the end of the Middle Bronze Age, in the time of Abraham. And the Bible says, burning stones and fire from Yahweh out of the heavens destroyed the city. It's exactly what we found. It was destroyed by a cosmic airburst that wiped out an entire civilization, 400 square kilometers, north and east of the Dead Sea in a flash. All that's being confirmed by the archeological record. So this well-watered landscape was thus destroyed, and it lay barren and without any agriculture or settlements for the next 700 years. It was a complete and utter annihilation. Now, the Mosaic Law. Remember we talked about Abraham's covenants. Abraham's covenants match the Middle Bronze Age. That's the time frame in which he lives. It's interesting that the Mosaic Law Code conforms to a very distinct configuration of Hittite treaties from the late Bronze Age and no other time frame. Joshua and Moses belong to the late Bronze Age. Moses' law code matches only literature, covenants, and treaties from that period and none other. It's an amazing thing. The price of Joseph's slavery. I like this one. Joseph was sold into slavery for 20 shekels, according to Genesis 37. Now, according to the Bible timeline, the Bible chronology, Joseph lives also in the Middle Bronze Age. If you take all of the contract and treaty documents from all the cultures of the Near East in that period of time, and you analyze the price of slaves in all of those trade documents, you know what the average going price of a slave is in the Middle Bronze Age? You guessed it. It's 20 shekels. It's exactly as it should be. Nobody living 1,000 years later in the Iron Age would be able to guess such a thing, because you know what the going price of a slave was in the Iron Age? Upwards of 120 to 160 shekels. The Exodus events. Egypt's greatest dynasty in their history was the 18th dynasty. Now, the 18th dynasty is spectacular. I wish we could talk about it, but just a little brief couple of sentences here about it. It collapsed as a result of the Exodus events. The greatest dynasty in the history of Egypt came crashing down as a result of all those terrible things that the Bible describes that occurred to Egypt in the time of the Exodus. The plundering of Egyptian wealth, the loss of a large labor force, the decimation of Egypt's northern military forces, and the loss of Pharaoh himself, none other than Tutmosis IV. By the way, we just got some confirmation from the Jericho excavators about some very key things that absolutely support now that Tutmosis IV is in fact the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Don't have time to get into that, but we now know him, and we know him well. This is the only dynastic collapse in Egypt during the entire late Bronze Age. I don't care whether you take an early date for the Exodus or a late date for the Exodus. In all of that time frame, there's only one collapse of Egypt. Egypt is flying high the rest of the time. There's only one time of disastrous collapse, and that's after the death of Tutmosis IV. So, this dynastic collapse is exactly what one would predict if the events of the Exodus actually occurred. What's interesting about this is it's precisely, exactly happening, collapsing, when the Bible says the Exodus occurred. Look at this, the Exodus itinerary. That is, all of the places, the named locations through which the Israelites passed as they took this rather crazy circuitous route out of Egypt and all around and eventually wound up at Sinai. That Exodus itinerary in Numbers 33, tracks along known trade routes that are well attested from Egyptian map lists of the late Bronze Age. We have lists from Ramesses the Great and going back to Amenhotep II. We have even some lists going back to Tutmosis II, I believe. So several map lists on monuments. And what they do is they track routes going out from Egypt in various directions. And the Canaan route actually lists every location mentioned in Numbers 23 in the exact same order, going all the way up to Nebo. It's really incredible. So, the Exodus story geographically is confirmed by the Egyptians themselves. It's really amazing. Slave costs. Now, we looked at slave costs in Joseph's time, which was what? 20 shekels in the Middle Bronze Age, a few hundred years before Moses. Let's get down to the time of Moses. According to Exodus 21, in the Mosaic law, the cost to replace a slave was 30 shekels. Guess what? The average going price of a slave during the late Bronze Age was 30 shekels. What's interesting about this is the Bible writer even records the subtle inflationary curve of slave prices from the Middle Bronze Age to the Late Bronze Age. It's amazing. Now, nobody can guess this kind of stuff. You can't go centuries and centuries later and have Israelites concocting stories like this and getting it all right, getting these details right. It's not possible. And there it is, one of many proofs of the accuracy of the biblical text. I love this one. A lot of people haven't thought about this. I've never seen anybody write about it. You can read about it in the museum. Israelite literacy. Do you know there was no public literacy before Moses? Isn't that interesting? Why was the lack of public literacy a help to the great empires and to the kingdoms of the ancient world? Why was it preferred to keep the masses illiterate? Because information is power. And power, in their minds, needed to reside solely in the hands of their monarchs and of their royals. That's it. You keep the people ignorant. God wanted the Israelites to have the power in their own hands, and the power was the Word of God, especially the law. How do we know that God commanded literacy of the Israelites? Let me just read this little paragraph. Yahweh required literacy of Israel. It's Deuteronomy 27, I'll quote it in a second. In preparation for which the Semitic alphabet was invented in Egypt during the centuries when the Israelites sojourned there. Remember, from the time of Joseph and Jacob. Okay? From that time, the alphabet was invented. And that same alphabet chronologically followed the Israelites into the Sinai wilderness and into Canaan, tracing their biblical presence to all these locations. Now, so, well, I thought writing was invented way back there around 3,300 BC. Hieroglyphics, Mesopotamian cuneiform, all of those. Those are not alphabets. Those are writing systems, and they're very complex with hundreds of characters. Very difficult to learn. In fact, nobody can learn it except for a scribe who, from the time of being a young child, learns for many, many years how to do that language, how to write those systems. An alphabet is a simplification, somewhere between 20 and 30 letters, reflecting the range of human vocalization, so that you can write any language with an alphabet, a fixed small number of characters in a fixed order, so that an adult of average intelligence can learn to read and even write in a very short manner, in a weekend, in a week, in 2 weeks, you can do it. Now, why would such an alphabet be invented? By the way, how many times has an alphabet been invented in the history of the world? One. Okay, the Cherokee alphabet, but that's artificial. Okay. One time in the history of the world, the alphabet comes forth, and every other alphabet we know of from Arabic to Hebrew to Russian to Greek, all is a derivative of that same initial alphabet, Semitic alphabet. All comes from the same root, that alphabet. That alphabet is invented when the Israelites were in Egypt, follows the Israelites around into Sinai, into the Sinai wilderness, and up into Canaan, wherever they go, according to the proper dates that the Bible describes. That's exactly it. Now why? Now let's go back to Deuteronomy 27. Yahweh said to Joshua and Moses, he said, when the Israelites get ready to cross, when you get ready to cross the Jordan, on the opposite bank, on the west bank, in the promised land, I want you to set up 3 large standing stones. And I want you to plaster them over with plaster. And I want you to write upon them all the words of the law. That's a command of literacy. He says, as the Israelites go in, each Israelite will read the words of the law. It's a big billboard. All the words of the law. By the way, now you know why Hebrew goes from right to left. Because it must have been on their right side as they come in on the shore, right? Oh, we're going this way, so we got to read it right to left as we move into the promised land. And by the way, ancient languages could be read left to right, right to left, up, down, sideways, and diagonally. They just somehow settled on right to left. So, God wanted the Israelites to be able to read. Why? Because He wanted the Israelites to read the law, memorize the law, know the law, and hold their leaders accountable to the law. A first in history. And that alphabet is the key to accomplishing that. It's amazing to me. All right. Canaanite religious practices. You go to the law, to the Mosaic law, and all through the Mosaic law there are prohibitions left and right dealing directly with the religions of Canaan. The practices of these religions, child sacrifice, ritual prostitution, all kinds of stuff that you really can't talk about in children's Sunday school. But it's all laid out in the Mosaic law. It's very clear. Now, Bronze Age religious practices are detailed in Genesis through Joshua. We see it. Not only do the Mosaic narratives accurately depict the gods, goddesses, cult practices of Canaan, but also the books of Joshua and Judges reveal how the Israelites rebelled against Yahweh to embrace these very pagan beliefs. All of this is confirmed dramatically in the archaeological record. Everything the Bible talks about, every god, every pagan god, every goddess, every practice, everything about the Canaanite cults is confirmed in the archaeological record. We see it, and unfortunately and sadly, as the biblical record describes, we see it in the Israelite communities. All right, so it's exactly what the Bible describes. Joshua's conquest. Joshua conquered an Egyptianless Canaan. Remember, all the way from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and Joshua, God promised, here's what God said to all of them. I am going to bring you into a land, a promised land, in which there are Canaanites, Amorites, and Hittites. Those are the 3 biggies. And then you got, Hivites, Jebusites, Perizzites, termites, all those other folks. But never Egyptians. Never are Egyptians mentioned as being part of Canaan. Now, this is interesting because, let me just finish reading this. Because precisely at the right historical moment, in the midst of the 18th dynasty collapse and withdrawal from Canaan, as a result of the Exodus events, we have an Egyptianless Canaan. The first half of the Late Bronze Age, from around 1550 to about 1400 BC, is known as the Egyptian domination of the Levant. It's known as the time, books are written about it, the time of the Egyptian domination of the Levant. It wasn't just Egyptian domination. The Egyptian border had been moved from the Pelusiac branch of the Nile north to the Euphrates River. Egypt, it became Egypt. It was controlled by an iron fist for much of this period by Egypt. It was the collapse of the 18th dynasty at the time of the Exodus that caused the Egyptians to withdraw entirely from Syria and Canaan. So that by the time Joshua came into the land, there were no Egyptians. None of the promises of Yahweh to give this land to Israel ever mention Egyptians in Canaan, and neither are Egyptian troops mentioned in Joshua's campaigns. If Joshua had entered into Canaan 3 or 4 years before he did, he would have had to fight Egyptians. Not local Canaanites, he'd had to fight the Egyptians. But they are now gone. It is no coincidence that in the decades following the death of Pharaoh Thutmose IV, that's the Pharaoh of the Exodus, during whose short reign the terrible events had occurred, Egypt withdrew from its Asiatic territories, leaving Joshua to take the promised land with no threat of Egyptian interference or retaliation. They're long gone. God promised them an Egyptianless Canaan, and they got an Egyptianless Canaan. That's a stunning historical fact. It's also an amazing fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The Battle of Jericho. Joshua takes Jericho in the mid-14th century, 40 years after the death of the Exodus Pharaoh, Thutmose IV. It's an archeological fact. There was no late Bronze Age settlement at Jericho in the first part of the late Bronze Age. There was nothing before the 14th century BC at Jericho, and there was nothing after the 14th century BC at Jericho, all the way down to about 1000 BC. Jericho has no occupation except for a short period of time. In fact, about a 50-year occupation from sometime around 1400 to sometime in the middle of the 14th century. That's it. In other words, there's only one possible fortified Jericho that could have been the city of Rahab, as we say in Oklahoma. Rahab. That's historical precision. That's amazing. The Bible says exactly when Joshua comes to town. It just so happens that that's the only Jericho available to destroy in the whole late Bronze Age. Just that little period of time. Voila. The people of Israel. Merneptah Stela, around 1210 to 1205, somewhere in there. This is Ramesses the Great's very old, 80-year-old son who finally came to the throne after Ramses the Great ruled for 64 years. One of his youngest sons, Merneptah, in his 80s, he comes to the throne. He puts up this stela. And what he wants to confirm is that he conquers everybody around. It's just a brag. It's not really true. But he confirms that Israel was well enough established in Canaan to be recognized by Pharaoh Merneptah as one of the perennial enemies or 9 bows of Egypt. On this stela, Israel is designated by a very particular hieroglyphic symbol as a people, not a nation with a king, a people group, which is spot on. It is exactly correct. Now, here's the Merneptah stela. And on this, by the way, it's a brag, it's not true. By the way, this is 1210. This is just not too far after the time of the Exodus. Israel, by this time, by the way, if Yul Brynner is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, if you catch my drift, If Ramesses the Great is Pharaoh of the Exodus, and the Israelite, which would make the Israelite Exodus sometime around 1250 or so, 1210, I mean, somewhere in the 1200s, how can his sons, Stela, confirm Israel as one of the 9 perennial enemies of Egypt already, if it just barely happened? Well, you have to move that Exodus backward. You have to give the Israelites time to forge out their territory and to flesh it out and to control it and to be recognized as a perennial enemy of Egypt. Here's what it says it says, Israel, and then again, this is a brag. Israel, his seed is no more. That's what Merneptah says about Israel. This is the first mention of Israel in an ancient document outside the Bible. I titled this one, Smite, Smote, Smitten. Do you love verbs? English ones, they're just weird the way they do that. The phrase in the Bible, to smite with the edge of the sword, is an idiom derived from the single edge, curved battle axes of the Middle and Late Bronze Age, the final form of which was a very elegant weapon called a sickle sword, because it's shaped like a sickle with the cutting edge on its outer curve. These were hacking or smiting swords with no thrusting point. They just have a curved edge like a scimitar and a single edge, and you don't stab somebody with it, you hack them with it. Thus, to smite with the edge, singular, to smite with the edge of the sword was an apt description of this class of weaponry by the end of Iron Age 1, around 1000 BC. That'd be about the beginning of King David's reign. The sickle sword was completely extinct. I say all but extinct, but it's pretty much done for. It's gone from history. It was replaced, of course, by the straight, pointed, double-edged sword, the typical sword that we think of from antiquity. Now, it's no coincidence that this idiom of smiting with the edge, singular, of the sword is connected only with passages of Scripture that belong to the Bronze Age part of the Bible, not those that belong to the Iron Age part of the Bible. It appears 24 times in the Bronze Age Scriptures, but trails off shortly after the book of Judges. It's not found again, hardly at all. It's interesting. The idiom dies out in common use after its namesake sickle sword disappeared from history. Is that a coincidence? No. Here's a sickle sword. You can see this one in the museum. You can hold it in your hand and just don't cut yourself. To smite with the edge of the sword, the sickle sword. Here's one you might not guess at. The Philistines and our buddy Homer. Iliad, Odyssey, call those. Homer's Iliad confirms the authenticity of an Aegean-style ritual sequence enacted by the Philistines in 1 Samuel 5 and 6. Wow, that's weird. I mean, I don't have time to go into it, but there's a ritual sequence with about 6 points of ritual that's described in 1 Samuel 5 and 6. By the way, it has to do with remember when the Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant from Israel? That's this. And every place the Ark of the Covenant went and all the cities of the Philistines, God has a great sense of humor. He struck them with, I love the good old King James rendering of that, hemorrhoids. So every place the ark went, the Israelites were not the Philistines were not sitting comfortably. So they pushed it off to another location, and it did this little tour around Philistia until they got to the city of Ekron, and they had had enough. They said, send this cotton-picking thing back to the Israelites. But how do we stole this from their God. How do you return such an object? Well, we know from the book of Homer that the Mycenaean Greeks had a very specific ritual sequence for returning a stolen object to a god or a king. And it's mirrored precisely even to the sacrifice of the bulls, to the placing of the golden mice and tumors on the ox cart, and so on. All this kind of stuff. It's all there. Guess what? The Philistines, we know for a fact, are the descendants of the Mycenaean Greeks. It's amazing. How do you think you could connect the Bible with Homer? It's amazing. All right, quickly now in our last couple of minutes here. The Iron Age Bible. David and Solomon. If you take David and Solomon's little mini empire that they carved out between Mesopotamia and Egypt, if you look at that, we could predict its existence if the Bible didn't even exist. You take the Bible away, we would still predict a kingdom would exist in that territory exactly where David's and Solomon's kingdom is located. How do we know that? Because we know where all the kingdoms are around it. We know their territories historically. And there's a big gap right in the middle. So scholars who say, well, the size of King David's and Solomon's territory is it's nonsensical. It's not historical. Yes, it is. We would even predict that such a kingdom would exist even if the Old Testament were not in our possession. The Davidic dynasty was long poo-pooed by various scholars as completely mythical, completely legend. David's name was had never been found outside the text of the Bible. Until back in the 1990s, guess what? A little text came, a fragment of an Aramean text called the Tel Dan Stela, or the Tel Dan inscription, mentions the house, that is to say the dynasty of David, and an Egyptian inscription refers to the heights of, that's one in Egypt, mentions the heights of David, that is the central highland location of Hebron and Jerusalem, two of David's capital cities, confirming that King David was a historical figure. The Egyptians talk about the heights of David, and the Aramean inscription, which also mentions several other biblical characters, talks about the dynasty of David. Even the Mesha stela, which is a 19th century stela, which I'm not going to get into tonight, it mentions the Israelite king Omri, but in that same stela, it also likely refers to the house of David. It has not just the Beit David, but the Beit D. Beit, house of D. We just have the first letter. Nothing else it could be. It's probably house of David as well. So now we have at least two and probably three references to King David as a historical figure. Here is the Tel Dan Stela. We have a replica of this in the museum. And you can see here, and you can read it, Beit David. Okay, there it is. House of David. Solomon's wealth. After King Solomon died, Shawshank I, or biblical Shishak, came racing in during the time of his son Rehoboam. He plundered Jerusalem's palace and temple. And according to Egyptian records, Shawshank died just 1 year after plundering Jerusalem. His son, Ozorkon I, after barely 3 years of being on the throne, made some very spectacular gifts to the Egyptian gods, including one offering that equaled 383 tons of silver and gold. That's a lot. At this rather depressed time in Egyptian history, where did all of this vast wealth come from? This is not a high part of Egyptian history. This is the low, very bad, terrible time in Egyptian history called the late period. So at this depressed time in Egyptian economy, where does Ozorkon get this massive wealth? It is very likely from Solomon's treasures that his father brought back to Egypt. Is this a coincidence? No, I don't think so. I think it matches up with the historical record quite nicely. Hezekiah and Sennacherib. The Prism of Sennacherib records an Assyrian invasion of 46 fortified Judean cities, including Jerusalem, under Hezekiah, also recorded in 2 Kings 18 and 19 and Isaiah 36 and 37. In this account, that is on the Sennacherib prism, in this account of his third campaign, Sennacherib describes his victories over several Levantine kingdoms, after which he encountered the Egyptian army. The Egyptian commander is not named in Sennacherib's annals, but it is named, he is named in the Old Testament as Teharka in 2 Kings 19 and Isaiah 37, who was a Nubian ruler who later became Pharaoh Teharka of Egypt. Look at that intertwining of the historical record, the Egyptian record, the biblical record. The Egyptian record giving us insight into the biblical record. The biblical record giving us insight into Sennacherib's identification of the Egyptian general that he encountered. It's really amazing. Here's Sennacherib's prism. Here's what he says about Hezekiah on the prism. He says, by the way, there's at least 3 of these in different museums. They made copies of them in antiquity. As for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem. By the way, the Sennacherib's prism does not say that Sennacherib conquered Jerusalem or that he destroyed it. It says he laid siege to it. What does the Bible say? Overnight, the angel of Yahweh killed all of his troops. Oops. Through that prism, he says, I went to Judea, I conquered this city and that city, I conquered it, I destroyed it, over and over and over. He gets to Jerusalem, he says, I laid siege. Never says he destroyed it. Never says he conquered it. Why? The Bible gives us the reason. The angel of Yahweh destroyed the army of Sennacherib. Pretty amazing. Last one. Daniel and Belshazzar. The Nabonidus cylinder sets the record straight on the accuracy of Daniel by confirming that his son Belshazzar was in fact the last ruling monarch in Babylon the night it fell to the Medes and the Persians. That's confirmed in the record, but it was never known before the discovery of this set of cylinders mentioning Nabonidus, his son, and his rule over Babylon, his son Belshazzar. Belshazzar, the name Belshazzar in the book of Daniel was laughed at as being non-historical because that name had never been seen in any other historical source except the Bible. And it was finally confirmed by archaeology that Belshazzar was, in fact, the last ruling monarch in the city of Babylon when it fell to the Medes and the Persians. Now, here are the cylinders of Nabonidus, and there are bunches of them.